Have you ever sat quietly and wondered if hope can truly rebuild a broken life? In this video, I share my real story living in a small town in Georgia, where ordinary days, family struggles, and simple conversations slowly changed everything. If you feel tired, lost, or close to giving up, stay with this story, because sometimes hope begins in the smallest places. Bold question in a quiet night. What if hope is not something you find, but something you slowly rebuild? This story begins in a small town in Georgia, where ordinary days, family responsibilities, quiet worries, and simple conversations slowly changed the way I looked at life. Nothing dramatic. No big speeches. Just real moments. And if life has ever felt heavy lately, this story might feel strangely familiar. The night this story begins was very quiet. Not the kind of quiet you see in movies where something scary is about to happen. Just the slow, ordinary quiet of a small American town after most people have gone to bed. I was sitting on the wooden porch behind my house in Georgia. The air felt warm and slightly humid, the way summer nights usually feel in the southern United States. Somewhere nearby, crickets were making their steady nighttime music. Across the street, a single street lamp lit a small circle of yellow light on the pavement. One pickup truck was parked under it. Nothing was moving. From the outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Calm. Simple. The kind of place people imagine when they think about life in a small American town. But inside my mind, things were not so calm. Life has a quiet way of becoming heavy without asking permission. It rarely happens in one big moment. Instead, it builds slowly. Work responsibilities. Family expectations. Marriage challenges. Raising children. Bills that appear every month like clockwork. One day, everything feels manageable. Then suddenly one evening you sit alone and realize something strange. You feel tired. Not physically tired, but the deeper kind of tired that lives inside your thoughts. That night on the porch, I was holding a cup of coffee even though it was already close to midnight. In many small towns in the United States, it is normal to sit outside late in the evening. People breathe the cooler air after a long day. Some talk with neighbors. Some just watch the street quietly. But that night I was not relaxing. I was thinking. Thinking about how life had slowly changed over the past few years. From the outside, everything looked normal. There was a home. There was a family. There were children running around the house during the day, filling the rooms with noise and energy. There was work. There was routine. But inside, something felt unclear. Not broken. Just uncertain. In psychology, researchers often describe a moment like this as cognitive overload. It happens when the brain carries too many responsibilities at the same time. Your mind keeps solving problems all day, family decisions, financial worries, future plans, until it quietly runs out of emotional energy. When that happens, the brain begins asking deeper questions. Questions people rarely say out loud. Questions like, is this really the direction my life should be going? Am I doing the right things for my family? Why does everything feel heavier than it used to? Sitting there in that quiet Georgia night, those questions slowly started appearing in my mind. The interesting thing about life in America, especially in smaller towns, is that everything looks stable on the surface. On Saturday mornings you see neighbors cutting grass. People wash their cars in the driveway. Children ride bicycles down the street. Dogs bark behind wooden fences. If you walk past, everyone smiles politely and says, "Hey, how's it going?" It feels simple. But behind every front door, every family has their own complicated story. Some families are trying to save money. Some couples are working through disagreements. Some parents worry about how to raise children in a fast-changing world. And many people, even in peaceful places, are quietly searching for something. Hope. Hope is a strange word. It sounds soft, almost poetic. But in real life, hope is actually a powerful psychological force. Studies from the American Psychological Association show that people who believe their future can improve are more likely to take small daily actions that slowly change their lives. Hope doesn't magically fix problems, but it changes how the brain approaches those problems. Without hope, the brain shuts down possibilities. With hope, the brain begins searching for solutions. That night, sitting alone with my coffee, I realized something uncomfortable. I had been focusing on problems for too long. Not solutions. Problems. Work stress. Family pressure. Small misunderstandings that happen in every marriage. Little frustrations that slowly grow larger when people are tired. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet weight of everyday life. Across the street, a light turned on in my neighbor's house. Mr. Daniel lived there. He had lived in this town for decades. One of those calm people who always waved when driving by. Sometimes when we passed each other, he said simple things like, "Nice evening tonight." Or, "Take it easy." Very simple English. But warm. Moments like that are interesting when you think about real spoken English. People imagine English conversations must be complex. But most real communication is simple. Short sentences. Clear tone. Genuine feeling. Sometimes the simplest words carry the most meaning. Watching the light in my neighbor's house that night, another thought appeared in my mind. A quiet question. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just simple. Can hope actually rebuild a life? Not the way motivational books describe it, but in ordinary life. In real families. In real marriages. In houses where toys are on the floor and dishes sit in the kitchen sink. Could hope really change anything? At that moment, I didn't know the answer. But that question stayed in my mind. And over the next months, living here in this small Georgia town, something surprising began to happen. Small conversations. Unexpected moments. Simple habits. Little changes in the way people around me looked at life. Slowly, piece by piece, those things started teaching me something important. Hope does not arrive like a big announcement. It grows quietly. Inside everyday life. Inside ordinary routines. Inside moments most people would never notice. And strangely enough, the first step of that change did not begin with a big life decision. It began with something much simpler. A short conversation. A cup of coffee. And a small town in Georgia that most travelers would drive past without ever stopping. But for me, that quiet place was about to become the beginning of something unexpected. A new way of understanding life, family, marriage, and hope. Life in a quiet Georgia town. Morning in a small Georgia town does not begin with noise. It begins slowly. The sun rises gently over the trees. The streets stay quiet for a while. A few cars pass. Someone walks a dog. Somewhere in the distance, you might hear the soft sound of a lawnmower starting up. Life here moves at a different rhythm. And that rhythm can teach you a lot about life, if you are patient enough to notice it. The morning after that quiet night on my porch, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still calm. My children were asleep. My wife was still in bed. The sunlight coming through the kitchen window painted soft lines across the table. Coffee first. That's a habit many Americans share. In fact, according to surveys in the United States, more than 60% of adults drink coffee every morning. For many people, that small cup is not just a drink. It's a pause. A moment before the day begins. I poured my coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The house felt peaceful. But inside my mind, the question from the night before was still there. Can hope really rebuild a life? Sometimes questions stay in your mind longer than you expect. Psychologists say the brain does something interesting when a question becomes emotionally important. Instead of ignoring it, your mind begins quietly searching for answers in everyday experiences. You start noticing things you never paid attention to before. That morning, I looked through the window at the street outside our home. A neighbor across the road was walking slowly to his mailbox. Another person was jogging down the sidewalk with headphones. Nothing dramatic. Just normal life in a small American town. But suddenly I realized something I had overlooked for a long time. Life here is simple in a very intentional way. People in large cities often move fast. They rush from place to place. They measure success through busy schedules and constant activity. But small towns work differently. Here, people value routine. Morning coffee. Talking to neighbors. Family dinners. Church on Sunday. Watching children play outside in the evening. Those routines may look ordinary, but they create something powerful, stability. And stability is something the human brain deeply needs. Researchers in behavioral psychology explain that predictable daily routines reduce stress hormones in the body. When life feels stable, the brain becomes more capable of solving problems and rebuilding motivation. In other words, calm environments quietly help people heal. That realization stayed with me as the day continued. Later that morning, my children woke up and ran into the kitchen like small hurricanes. If you have children, you know this moment. Suddenly the quiet house becomes full of energy. One child asks for cereal. Another asks where their shoes are. Someone laughs. Someone spills milk. Life becomes loud again. But there is something beautiful about that chaos. Because it reminds you what really matters. Family. In many American families today, parents often worry about balancing work and home life. Studies show that modern parents spend more time with their children than parents did decades ago, but they also feel more pressure. More expectations. More responsibility. Sometimes that pressure creates tension inside marriages too. And if we are honest, marriage is not always easy. Two people from different backgrounds, different personalities, different ways of thinking, trying to build a stable life together. It sounds simple in theory. But in real life, it takes patience. That morning, while helping my children prepare for the day, I noticed something about my own thinking. For months, maybe even years, I had been focusing mostly on the difficult parts of life. Work stress. Family disagreements. Financial responsibilities. Small frustrations that slowly build up over time. But something about that quiet night on the porch had shifted my perspective slightly. Just enough to ask a new question. What if the problem wasn't my life? What if the problem was the way I was looking at my life? That thought stayed with me as the day moved forward. Later in the afternoon, the Georgia sun grew warmer. The streets became busier. A school bus passed slowly down the road, children laughing through the open windows. In the United States, school buses are a familiar sight in small towns. They move slowly through neighborhoods, stopping frequently to pick up or drop off students. Watching that yellow bus disappear around the corner, another realization appeared quietly. Every person in that bus has a future still forming. Children naturally believe tomorrow will be better. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, many people slowly lose that belief. Responsibilities grow. Disappointments happen. Life becomes complicated. Hope becomes quieter. But maybe hope never disappears completely. Maybe it simply waits for the right moment to return. That afternoon I decided to take a short walk through the neighborhood. Walking is a simple habit many Americans use to clear their thoughts. Studies from Harvard Medical School show that even a 20-minute walk can improve mood and reduce mental stress. The streets were calm. Tall trees lined the sidewalks. A flag moved gently in the warm Georgia breeze outside one house. And then something small happened. A neighbor watering his lawn looked up and smiled. Nice day, isn't it? Just 5 words. Very simple English. But something about that moment felt important. Because real connection often begins with small conversations like that. No pressure. No deep discussion. Just human kindness. And sometimes those tiny interactions are the first steps toward something bigger. Looking back now, that quiet day in Georgia may not seem like the beginning of an important story. Nothing dramatic happened. No life-changing announcement. Just a peaceful town. A normal family day. A few simple conversations. But sometimes the most meaningful changes in life begin exactly like that. Quietly. Almost invisibly. And over the next few days, something unexpected would happen that would slowly push my thinking in a completely new direction. It would begin in a place many people in small towns know very well. A local coffee shop. And a conversation I never planned to have. The day everything felt heavy. Not every difficult day in life begins with bad news. Sometimes a day starts normally. The sun rises. The coffee tastes the same. The house wakes up slowly. Children laugh in the hallway. Nothing looks wrong. But inside your mind, something feels different. That kind of day arrived quietly a few mornings after the night I sat on the porch thinking about hope. The house was already full of small sounds. One of my children was looking for a missing shoe. Another was asking 100 questions before breakfast. My wife was moving around the kitchen preparing things for the day. From the outside, everything looked like a normal family morning. But inside my head, there was a strange weight. Not anger. Not sadness. Just pressure. Psychologists sometimes call this feeling mental load. It happens when your brain is constantly managing responsibilities, family decisions, schedules, finances, work problems, future plans. None of them are emergencies. But together they form a quiet mountain in your mind. And that morning, I felt that mountain. The coffee was still warm in my hand, but my thoughts were already racing ahead. Bills coming next week. Work responsibilities waiting later that day. Things around the house that needed fixing. Parent responsibilities that never truly stop. Marriage conversations that sometimes felt unfinished. Life can feel like a long list that never ends. And sometimes the brain reacts in a very human way. It starts asking a dangerous question. Is this all too much? That question is more common than people admit. In fact, a study from the American Psychological Association found that a large number of adults in the United States report feeling overwhelmed by everyday responsibilities at least several times each month. Even in peaceful places. Even in stable families. Even in quiet towns like mine in Georgia. Because pressure does not always come from dramatic events. It comes from accumulation. Small worries stacking on top of each other. That morning, after the children left for school, the house finally became quiet again. Quiet houses can be peaceful. But sometimes they also leave space for thoughts you've been avoiding. I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the same sunlight through the window as a few days earlier. But my thoughts were different this time. My mind replayed small frustrations from recent weeks. Conversations that didn't go smoothly. Moments when patience disappeared too quickly. Little misunderstandings that happen in every marriage. None of these problems were huge. But when your mind is tired, even small problems feel bigger. And something strange happens when people feel mentally overloaded. The brain begins imagining escape. Not dramatic escape. Just simple thoughts like, what if life was easier somewhere else? What if things were simpler? What if I could start over? Those thoughts are not signs of weakness. They are signs that the brain is searching for relief. But relief rarely comes from running away from life. Real relief usually comes from changing the way we see life. At that moment, however, I didn't have that clarity yet. Instead, I did something simple. I decided to leave the house for a while. Not to escape anything serious. Just to breathe. One of the quiet advantages of living in a small Georgia town is that you can step outside and almost immediately feel space around you. There are fewer cars. Fewer crowds. More trees. More sky. I walked slowly down the street, hands in my pockets, letting the warm air settle my thoughts. A dog barked somewhere behind a wooden fence. A delivery truck rolled past slowly. Somewhere nearby someone was cutting grass, a very familiar sound in American neighborhoods. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. And yet my mind kept circling the same question. Why does life sometimes feel heavier than it should? Neuroscience actually offers an interesting explanation. The human brain evolved to detect problems quickly. Thousands of years ago, this ability helped humans survive danger in the wild. But in modern life, that same brain still searches for threats, even when the threats are not life or death situations. Deadlines. Arguments. Financial concerns. Parent responsibilities. The brain treats many of these like survival problems. Which means your mind can stay in a constant state of low-level stress without you even realizing it. As I continued walking through the neighborhood, another thought appeared. Maybe the problem was not that life had become heavier. Maybe the problem was that I had stopped noticing the good parts. Because they were everywhere. A father teaching his child to ride a bicycle near the corner. A woman watering flowers outside her house. Two neighbors laughing near a parked car. Life in small towns is full of tiny moments like this. Moments people often ignore. But those small moments are actually powerful signals to the brain. They remind us that life is still functioning. Still moving forward. Still full of possibility. I stopped near the end of the street where a large oak tree provided shade over the sidewalk. For a few minutes, I simply stood there, watching the quiet neighborhood. And something subtle shifted in my thinking. Not a dramatic change. Just a tiny adjustment. Instead of asking, why is life so heavy? A different question appeared. What if something small could make life lighter again? Not a huge change. Not a big decision. Just one small improvement. One conversation. One habit. One different way of reacting. Psychologists often talk about the small wins theory. The idea is simple. When people begin solving even tiny problems, the brain releases motivation chemicals like dopamine. Those chemicals create momentum for bigger positive changes. In other words, hope doesn't always arrive as a giant solution. Sometimes it begins with a very small shift. And strangely enough, that small shift for me was about to begin in the most ordinary place possible. A little coffee shop in town. A place where people talk. Laugh. Share stories. And sometimes, without realizing it, change each other's lives. I didn't know it yet. But the conversation waiting for me there would slowly start answering the question that had been following me for days. The question about hope. And whether hope could actually rebuild a life. A small conversation that opened my eyes. Some conversations last only 2 minutes. Yet somehow they stay in your mind for years. That afternoon in my small Georgia town, I was not expecting anything important to happen. I simply wanted a quiet place to sit for a while and clear my thoughts. The local coffee shop stood near the corner of Main Street. It was not a fancy place. No bright lights. No loud music. Just a warm wooden door, large windows, and the familiar smell of fresh coffee drifting into the street. Places like this are very common in small American towns. People don't only come for coffee. They come for conversation. When I walked inside, the room felt calm. A few people were sitting with laptops. Someone was reading a newspaper. 2 older men were talking softly near the window. The barista looked up and smiled. Good afternoon. What can I get for you? Simple words. Clear English. The kind of everyday language people use in real life. I'll take a medium coffee, I replied. Moments like this are actually helpful for anyone practicing real conversational English. In small daily interactions, people speak slowly, clearly, and naturally. You don't need complex vocabulary. Just simple communication. The barista handed me the cup. Here you go. Thank you. Again, simple words. But human connection often begins exactly like this. I found a seat near the window and looked outside at the quiet street. Cars passed slowly. A couple walked by holding hands. The afternoon sun made the sidewalks glow softly. For a few minutes, nothing happened. And then someone spoke. Mind if I sit here? I looked up. It was Mr. Daniel, the neighbor whose house light I had noticed the other night. He held a cup of coffee and wore his usual calm expression. Of course, I said. He sat down slowly, placing his cup on the table. For a moment we simply looked out the window. Small towns have a comfortable kind of silence between people. Nobody feels pressure to talk immediately. After a minute, he nodded toward the street. Town's quiet today. Yes, I said. Very quiet. Another pause. Then he looked at me with a thoughtful expression. You look like you've been thinking a lot lately. That sentence surprised me. Sometimes older people notice things younger people try to hide. I laughed softly. Maybe a little. He took a sip of his coffee. Life gets heavy sometimes, he said calmly. The interesting thing about American small-town culture is that conversations often become personal very naturally. People do not always ask direct questions, but they share observations that invite honesty. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I said something simple. Do you ever feel like life is a bit overwhelming? He nodded immediately. Oh sure, he said. Everyone does at some point. His answer was not dramatic. It was calm. Almost reassuring. And then he said something unexpected. You know what most people get wrong about hope? That word again. Hope. The same word that had been following my thoughts for days. I leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? He smiled faintly. People think hope is a feeling, he said. But it's not. That sentence stayed in the air for a moment. Psychologists actually support this idea. Research from positive psychology shows that hope is not simply an emotion. It is a mental strategy, a way of thinking about the future. Hope means believing two things. First, that improvement is possible. Second, that small actions can lead to that improvement. Mr. Daniel continued speaking slowly, the way people do when sharing something they have learned through experience. When I was younger, he said, I thought hope meant waiting for life to get easier. He shook his head gently. But life doesn't work that way. He pointed his finger lightly on the table. Hope isn't waiting. Hope is building. The simplicity of that sentence surprised me. Hope is building. Not dreaming. Not wishing. Building. Brick by brick. Day by day. Conversation by conversation. And suddenly something in my mind connected. For the past few weeks, I had been sitting with my thoughts, analyzing problems, feeling the weight of responsibilities. But I had not been building anything new. I had only been thinking. And thinking alone rarely changes life. Mr. Daniel looked out the window again. You've got a good family, he said quietly. I've seen your kids playing outside. I nodded. Yes. They seem happy. They are, I said. He smiled again. Then you're already doing something right. Sometimes we underestimate how powerful simple encouragement can be. Neuroscience research shows that positive social interactions activate reward systems in the brain. Even small supportive conversations can reduce stress and increase motivation. In other words, humans are designed to help each other regain hope. Mr. Daniel finished his coffee and stood slowly. Before leaving, he said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Life rarely changes in big dramatic moments, he said. Most real change happens in small habits. Then he added one more sentence. And the people who rebuild their lives are usually the ones who start small. He placed his empty cup on the counter and waved goodbye. The door closed behind him. And suddenly the coffee shop felt very quiet again. But my thoughts were no longer heavy the way they had been earlier that day. Instead, something new had appeared. Curiosity. Maybe hope wasn't something mysterious. Maybe it was simply something people practiced. In their marriages. In their families. In their daily conversations. As I sat there finishing my coffee, I realized something important. The answer to my question about hope might not come from big life decisions. It might come from watching how ordinary people live their lives every day in this small Georgia town. And the next lesson about hope was about to appear in a place many people visit every morning. Right here in this same coffee shop. But this time, the lesson would come from someone I never expected. The coffee shop lesson. Coffee shops in small American towns are interesting places. They are not just businesses where people buy drinks. They are small social centers. People come for 10 minutes, but sometimes they leave with something much more valuable than coffee, a new idea, a new perspective, or a conversation they did not expect. After Mr. Daniel left that afternoon, I stayed at the same table near the window. The cup in front of me was already empty, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. Something about that short conversation had changed the atmosphere inside my mind. The weight I had been carrying for days felt slightly lighter. Not gone. Just lighter. Psychologists explain that when someone hears a new perspective, the brain sometimes experiences a cognitive shift. That means the mind suddenly sees a problem from a different angle. And when that happens, curiosity appears. Instead of asking, "Why is my life difficult?" the brain begins asking a new question. What small thing could improve my life today? That question stayed with me while I watched the quiet activity inside the coffee shop. Near the counter, a young woman was preparing drinks. A man in a business shirt was typing on his laptop. Two older women were laughing softly at a corner table. And suddenly something simple caught my attention. The barista spoke to almost every customer in exactly the same warm way. Good afternoon. How's your day going? Take care. The sentences were very short. Very simple English. But they carried something important, kindness. In many parts of the United States, especially in smaller communities, people place great value on these small friendly interactions. They may seem insignificant, but they help create a feeling of belonging. And belonging is a powerful psychological need. According to research from Stanford University, people who feel connected to their community experience lower stress levels and higher life satisfaction. Watching the barista greet each person, I realized something interesting. She was not doing anything complicated. Just small gestures. A smile. A greeting. A short conversation. Yet those small actions were quietly improving other people's days. A few minutes later, she walked past my table and noticed my empty cup. Would you like a refill? She asked. Her voice was calm and friendly. Sure, I said. She returned with fresh coffee and placed it on the table. Rough day? She asked gently. I smiled. Something like that. She laughed softly. You're not the only one. Then she said something that sounded almost casual, but stayed in my mind. People come here with all kinds of stress. Work problems, family problems, life problems. But coffee helps. She paused for a moment. And talking helps too. Her sentence sounded simple. But it reflected something psychologists have known for decades. Talking about stress reduces stress. When people share thoughts with others, the brain releases chemicals like oxytocin that calm emotional tension. That is one reason why conversation plays such an important role in human relationships. Even small conversations. Even with strangers. As the afternoon continued, more people entered the coffee shop. A father arrived with his young daughter. The little girl pointed excitedly at a pastry display. "Can I have that one?" she asked. Her father smiled. "Only if you promise to finish your homework later." She nodded very seriously. "Deal." The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. But somehow it felt meaningful. Simple family moments like that are everywhere in American daily life. And yet many adults are often too busy worrying about problems to notice them. Watching that father and daughter, I felt another small shift in my thinking. Maybe hope doesn't always come from solving huge problems. Maybe it comes from paying attention to small good moments that already exist. Positive psychology research supports this idea. Studies show that people who consciously notice small positive experiences, like friendly conversations or family laughter, gradually increase their overall sense of happiness. The brain begins focusing less on problems and more on possibilities. That afternoon, the coffee shop slowly became busier. People greeted each other by name. Someone held the door open for a stranger. A man joked with the barista about needing extra strong coffee. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary human kindness. And something about that environment began answering the question that had been sitting in my mind since that quiet night on the porch. Can hope rebuild a life? Maybe the answer was not dramatic. Maybe hope grows exactly like this. Through ordinary moments. Through connection. Through simple habits that slowly change the atmosphere of everyday life. After finishing my second cup of coffee, I stood up to leave. But before I reached the door, the barista said one more thing. "See you tomorrow?" I laughed. "Maybe." She nodded. "Most people come back." Her sentence sounded like a simple business comment. But as I stepped outside into the warm Georgia afternoon, I realized it also contained a quiet truth about human life. People return to places where they feel understood. Where someone remembers them. Where conversations are easy. Where life feels just a little lighter. Walking back toward my house, I noticed the streets again. The tall trees. The quiet sidewalks. The slow rhythm of life in this small Georgia town. And suddenly something became clear. Hope might not arrive in one big moment. Instead, it might grow slowly through everyday experiences. A neighbor's advice. A stranger's kindness. A short conversation over coffee. At that moment, I did not know that the next lesson about hope would become even more personal. Because soon, another person in my life would begin changing the way I looked at everything. Not through speeches. Not through big dramatic moments. But through something much simpler. Love. And sometimes, love is the most powerful teacher of hope. The woman who changed my perspective. Love rarely arrives with dramatic music the way movies show it. In real life, it usually appears quietly, somewhere inside ordinary routines. A shared kitchen. A conversation in the evening. A small moment when two people suddenly realize they see the world differently. In my case, that quiet teacher of hope was the woman who shared my home every day, my wife. When people hear stories about love, they often imagine the exciting beginning of a relationship. The first dates. The butterflies. the romantic surprises. But the real story of love usually happens much later. It happens in daily life. In long conversations. In disagreements. In learning how two very different human beings slowly grow into one family. And living together in our small Georgia town, I began to notice something about the way my wife looked at life. She saw hope in places where I only saw problems. One evening, a few days after my conversation with Mr. Daniel and my quiet afternoon at the coffee shop, we were sitting together at the dinner table after the children had gone to bed. The house was finally calm again. Outside, the warm Georgia night air moved softly through the open window. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then everything became quiet again. My wife was reading something on her phone. I was thinking. Again. That had become a habit recently. She looked up and noticed my expression. "You're thinking about something again," she said. Her English was clear and natural, the kind of everyday conversation people hear in American homes. I smiled a little. Maybe. She put the phone down and leaned back in her chair. "What is it this time?" For a moment I hesitated. But sometimes honesty begins with very simple sentences. "I've been thinking about hope," I said. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Hope?" "Yes." I explained the conversation with Mr. Daniel at the coffee shop. I told her how he said hope was not something people wait for, but something people build. She listened quietly. Then she smiled. "That sounds like him," she said. I looked surprised. "You know him well?" She nodded. In small towns, everyone knows everyone. That is one interesting cultural detail about life in smaller American communities. Social networks often form naturally over time. People see each other in grocery stores, parks, coffee shops, schools. Conversations connect people in quiet ways. After a moment, she said something unexpected. "I think hope works the same way as love." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She folded her hands on the table. "People think love is a feeling," she said. "But feelings change all the time." That idea sounded familiar. It was similar to what Mr. Daniel had said about hope. My wife continued. "Real love is not only emotion. It's daily actions." She pointed gently toward the kitchen. "Cooking dinner." She pointed toward the hallway where our children's rooms were. "Raising children." Then she pointed toward me. "Staying when things are difficult." Her explanation matched something researchers in relationship psychology often say: long-term love survives not because feelings remain intense, but because partners choose supportive behaviors repeatedly over time. In other words, love is not just something you feel. It is something you practice. I leaned back in my chair and thought about that. Maybe hope and love were more similar than I realized. Both required small actions. Both required patience. Both required choosing not to give up too quickly. My wife looked at me again. "You've seemed worried lately," she said gently. I nodded. "Just thinking about responsibilities. Life. The future." She smiled softly. "Everyone worries about those things." Then she said something simple that stayed in my mind. "But worrying alone doesn't help much." Her voice was calm, not critical. Just honest. Many psychologists explain that people often carry stress silently, believing they must solve everything by themselves. But human beings are social creatures. Sharing responsibility with others often reduces mental pressure dramatically. That moment at the dinner table became one of those small turning points in my thinking. For days, I had been analyzing life like a complicated puzzle. But maybe the answer was not intellectual. Maybe the answer was relational. Hope grows stronger when people support each other. Marriage, in its healthiest form, is not about perfection. It is about teamwork. About two people reminding each other that difficult days do not define the entire story. My wife stood up and walked to the sink to wash a few dishes. The sound of running water filled the quiet kitchen. Then she said something that made me laugh. You know what helps people feel hopeful in America? What? I asked. Talking less about problems and doing small helpful things. She dried her hands and looked at me with a playful smile. Like helping with the dishes. We both laughed. That moment may sound simple. But sometimes humor is a powerful signal that tension is leaving a room. Psychologists often explain that shared laughter strengthens emotional bonds between people. It reminds the brain that life is not only responsibility. It is also connection. As we finished cleaning the kitchen together, I realized something important. Hope was no longer just a question in my mind. It was starting to appear inside ordinary family moments. Inside conversations. Inside cooperation. Inside laughter. And slowly, piece by piece, I began seeing something clearly. Maybe rebuilding a life does not require dramatic change. Maybe it begins with something much simpler. Two people choosing to move forward together. But the next lesson about hope was still waiting. Because sooner or later, every marriage faces a moment when hope is tested. And that test was coming sooner than I expected. Learning to speak again. Silence can be comfortable. But sometimes silence hides problems. In many families, difficult conversations do not happen because people are afraid of making things worse. So instead of talking openly, they choose quiet routines. Dinner. Work. Watching television. Going to sleep. Life continues moving forward, but the deeper thoughts stay locked inside. For a long time, I did something similar. Not intentionally. Not because I wanted distance from my family. But because speaking honestly about stress or fear can feel uncomfortable. Many people grow up believing they must solve problems alone. But something interesting happens in healthy American families, especially in smaller communities like our town in Georgia. People gradually learn that communication is not a weakness. It is survival. A few evenings after that conversation with my wife about hope and love, we found ourselves sitting in the living room after the children had gone to bed. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. Sometimes couples sit in silence like that. Not angry. Just tired. Life had been busy that week. School schedules, work responsibilities, errands around town, the normal rhythm of family life. But my mind returned to something my wife had said earlier. Worrying alone doesn't help much. That sentence stayed with me. For years, I had carried many thoughts quietly. Small frustrations. Stress about responsibilities. Questions about whether I was doing enough for the family. The truth is, many adults experience this kind of mental pressure. According to research published in the Journal of Family Psychology, couples who communicate openly about stress tend to have stronger relationships and better emotional health than couples who keep their worries private. In other words, silence often makes problems heavier. Talking makes them lighter. That evening, I turned off the television. My wife looked at me with curiosity. "Everything okay?" she asked. I took a breath. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." The moment felt small, but also important. "I think I've been keeping too many thoughts in my head," I said slowly. She listened quietly. "I worry about work. About being a good father. About whether I'm doing enough for our family." The words came out slowly, but once they started, they felt strangely relieving. Psychologists call this process emotional release. When people express thoughts that have been trapped inside their minds, stress hormones in the body begin to decrease. My wife didn't interrupt. She simply listened. And sometimes that is the most powerful response. After a moment, she nodded. "I'm glad you told me," she said. Her reaction surprised me slightly. There was no criticism. No judgment. Just understanding. Then she said something simple. "You don't have to carry everything alone." That sentence may sound obvious, but hearing it out loud changes how the brain processes stress. When people feel supported, the brain activates regions associated with safety and trust. In that moment, something inside my thinking shifted again. Hope was beginning to look less like a mysterious idea and more like a shared process between people. The conversation continued. We talked about small things first. Daily routines. The children's school. Plans for the weekend. But gradually the conversation became deeper. We talked about expectations. About how easy it is for adults to become overwhelmed by responsibilities. About how marriage sometimes requires stepping back and remembering why two people started building a life together in the first place. At one point my wife smiled and said something that made me laugh. "You know what many couples forget?" "What?" "They stop talking like friends." That idea felt surprisingly true. In the early days of relationships, couples talk about everything. Dreams. Ideas. Funny stories. Random thoughts. But after years of responsibilities, many conversations become practical. Bills. Schedules. Tasks. And somewhere along the way, the friendship part becomes quieter. Psychologists often emphasize that friendship is one of the strongest predictors of long-term relationship success. Couples who continue sharing thoughts, humor, and curiosity tend to stay emotionally connected. That evening, we talked longer than usual. No big arguments. No dramatic confessions. Just honest conversation. But something about the atmosphere in the room felt different. Lighter. More open. And slowly I began to understand another piece of the puzzle about hope. Hope grows when communication returns. Because when people speak honestly, solutions become visible. When people stay silent, problems grow in the dark. Later that night, as we prepared to go to bed, my wife said something that stayed with me. "You know what I think hope really is?" "What?" I asked. She smiled. "It's when people decide to keep trying. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Just continuing to try. In relationships. In family life. In personal growth." Those simple words matched everything I had been slowly discovering over the past week. Mr. Daniel's advice. The kindness inside the coffee shop. The quiet strength inside my own home. Hope wasn't arriving as a sudden miracle. It was building gradually through conversations, habits, and shared effort. But life has a way of testing new understanding. Just when things begin feeling more stable, challenges often appear. And the next challenge for our family was about to reveal something important about culture, expectations, and family life in America. Because living together does not erase differences. Sometimes it highlights them. And those differences were about to teach us another unexpected lesson about hope. The cultural truth about American families. Families often look simple from the outside. A house. Parents. Children. Dinner together in the evening. But anyone who has lived inside a family knows the truth. Families are complicated. Not in a bad way, just in a very human way. Different personalities, different expectations, different habits, all sharing the same space and trying to move in the same direction. Living in our small town in Georgia, I began noticing something interesting about how many American families approach everyday life. They value independence very early. Children are encouraged to speak their opinions. Teenagers are expected to learn responsibility. Parents often try to balance discipline with freedom. At first, these ideas sounded simple. But when you live inside a family, cultural expectations can quietly create misunderstandings. One evening, a small situation in our home revealed this very clearly. It was a normal weekday. Dinner was finished, and the kitchen was full of small signs of family life, dishes in the sink, a half-empty glass of milk on the table. School papers scattered across the counter. Our children were in the living room working on homework. My wife was organizing things in the kitchen. And I noticed something that made me pause. One of our children had left their backpack on the floor in the hallway again. Now, this might sound like a tiny problem. But parents know that tiny problems sometimes become big discussions. I picked up the backpack and placed it near the door. A few minutes later, my wife noticed. "You moved it again," she said. "Yes," I replied. It was blocking the hallway. She nodded thoughtfully. Then she said something interesting. "Maybe we should let them move it themselves." I looked at her, slightly confused. "They forgot," I said. "Yes," she answered calmly. But learning responsibility is part of growing up. This moment might sound ordinary, but it reflected something deeper about American family culture. In many households across the United States, parents intentionally allow children to experience small consequences of their actions. Not as punishment, but as a way to teach responsibility. Psychologists often refer to this as natural consequences learning. Instead of solving every problem for children, parents allow kids to understand the results of their own choices. If a backpack stays on the floor, someone might trip. If homework is forgotten, the teacher notices. These small experiences slowly teach children independence. I leaned against the kitchen counter and thought about her idea. "Sometimes I just want things to stay organized," I said. She smiled. "I know." Then she added something thoughtful. "But children don't learn responsibility by watching adults fix everything." Her words made sense. Yet in real life, applying that idea can feel uncomfortable. Parents naturally want to protect their children from mistakes. But mistakes are often the best teachers. In fact, research from developmental psychology shows that children who are allowed to solve small problems independently develop stronger decision-making skills later in life. Standing there in the kitchen, I realized something. Family life is not only about love. It is also about learning how to grow together. And growth often includes small disagreements. My wife walked into the living room and spoke gently to our child. "Hey, can you bring your backpack to your room?" Our child looked up, slightly surprised. "Oh. I forgot." A few seconds later the backpack disappeared from the hallway. Problem solved. Simple. But that tiny moment showed something important. Sometimes parents carry stress that doesn't actually belong to them. They try to control every detail, every schedule, every responsibility. And slowly, that pressure builds inside their minds. But families work better when responsibility is shared. Not only between adults, but also with children as they grow. Later that evening, after the kids went to bed, my wife and I sat on the couch talking again. The house was quiet. Outside, the Georgia night air moved softly through the trees. I told her something that had been slowly forming in my thoughts. Maybe I've been trying to control too many things. She smiled knowingly. That's very normal. Many adults struggle with this. According to behavioral studies, the human brain often believes that controlling more details will reduce stress. But the opposite is usually true. Trying to control everything creates exhaustion. Learning to trust others, even children, can reduce pressure significantly. That evening, I noticed something interesting about our home. The atmosphere felt calmer than it had earlier that week. Not because problems disappeared, but because perspective had changed. Instead of seeing family life as a long list of responsibilities, I started seeing it as a shared process of growth. Parents learning patience. Children learning responsibility. Partners learning how to support each other. And slowly, the idea of hope became clearer. Hope was not about a perfect life. Hope was about progress. Small improvements. Better conversations. Healthier habits. A family moving forward together, even when things were not perfect. Before going to bed that night, my wife said something thoughtful. "You know what strong families do?" "What?" I asked. "They keep adjusting." She explained that no family stays exactly the same. Children grow. Responsibilities change. People learn new ways of handling stress. The families that succeed are not the ones without problems. They are the ones who adapt. That sentence stayed in my mind. Because life was about to test that idea very soon. Every family eventually faces a season when stress becomes heavier again. And for us, that season was closer than we expected. The next chapter of this story would show whether the hope we had been slowly building was strong enough to survive a truly difficult moment. The hard season of our marriage. Every marriage has seasons. Some seasons feel light and joyful. Conversations flow easily. Laughter fills the house. Life feels balanced. Other seasons feel heavier. Not because love disappears, but because life becomes complicated. In our home in that quiet Georgia town, one of those difficult seasons arrived slowly, almost quietly. At first, nothing dramatic happened. Just small tensions. Busy schedules. Less time for conversations. More responsibilities than usual. Life was moving quickly, and like many couples, we began focusing on daily tasks instead of emotional connection. Psychologists often describe this as the drift phase in relationships. Two people are still committed, still living together, still caring about the family, but the emotional attention between them becomes weaker because life demands so much energy elsewhere. That period began for us during a particularly busy month. Work responsibilities increased. The children had school events and activities. Our evenings became a series of routines. Dinner, homework, cleaning, preparing for the next day, then sleep. Day after day, the schedule repeated. At first, this seemed normal. Families everywhere experience busy weeks. But something subtle began changing. The long conversations we had recently rediscovered started becoming shorter again. The laughter in the evenings became less frequent. Not gone, just quieter. And one night, the tension finally appeared in a small but meaningful moment. It was late evening. The house was messy after a long day. Toys on the floor. Dishes waiting in the sink. School papers on the table. I walked into the kitchen and saw everything at once. Without thinking, I said something in a frustrated tone. "Why is everything so disorganized tonight?" The words were simple, but the tone carried stress. My wife looked up immediately. She had also been tired. "You think I didn't notice," she replied. The room suddenly felt different. This is how many arguments begin. Not with big issues, but with small moments when two tired people react emotionally. In relationship psychology, researchers call this stress spillover. Pressure from work or responsibilities spills into family interactions. The argument that followed was not dramatic. No shouting. But the frustration was real. For a few minutes, both of us expressed the stress we had been quietly carrying. Schedules. Responsibilities. Feeling overwhelmed. It was not really about the messy kitchen. It was about exhaustion. Eventually the conversation ended in silence. She went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen. Moments like this are uncomfortable, but they are extremely common in long-term relationships. According to studies from the Gottman Institute, even strong marriages experience repeated periods of conflict and tension. What matters is not whether disagreements happen, but how couples recover from them. Standing alone in the kitchen that night, I remembered something Mr. Daniel had said in the coffee shop days earlier. Life rarely changes in big dramatic moments. Most real change happens in small habits. At that moment, I realized something uncomfortable. Hope inside a relationship is fragile if people stop practicing those small habits. Communication. Kindness. Patience. During the past week, I had been learning about hope from conversations and observations. But now life was testing whether I truly understood those lessons. After a few minutes of quiet thinking, I did something simple. I walked upstairs. My wife was sitting on the edge of the bed reading. I sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said something honest. "I think we're both just tired." She looked at me and slowly nodded. That small acknowledgement changed the emotional atmosphere instantly. Instead of defending positions, we began recognizing the real problem. Fatigue. Stress. Too many responsibilities happening at the same time. Psychologists often emphasize that identifying the true cause of conflict is one of the most powerful tools for repairing relationships. Many arguments are not actually about the issue people mention. They are about underlying stress. Once we recognize that, the conversation became calmer. We talked about the past few weeks. About how busy life had become. About how easy it is for couples to lose emotional connection when responsibilities increase. Then my wife said something thoughtful. Maybe we need to slow down again. Those words reminded me of something I had noticed about life in our small Georgia town. People here value slower rhythms. Morning coffee. Evening walks. Neighbors talking on porches. Small routines that create space for connection. Somehow our family had drifted away from that rhythm. We had allowed life to become too fast. Too crowded with tasks. Too focused on responsibilities instead of relationships. That evening we made a simple decision. Nothing dramatic. Just one small change. We agreed to create more quiet time in our evenings again. Less rushing. More conversation. More moments where the family could simply exist together without pressure. It sounded like a tiny adjustment. But sometimes the smallest decisions protect the most important things. As we turned off the lights that night, I realized something powerful. Hope in a marriage is not about avoiding difficult seasons. Every couple experiences them. Hope lives in the decision to repair the relationship when those seasons arrive. To talk again. To listen again. To remember why the partnership matters. And strangely enough, that difficult evening ended up teaching us something very important. Hope grows stronger when people refuse to give up during uncomfortable moments. But the story was not finished yet. Because the next lesson about hope would arrive from an unexpected place, our own children. And the perspective they brought into our home would change the way I understood hope forever. The habit that slowly saved us. Most people imagine that big life changes require big decisions. A new job. A new house. A dramatic conversation that suddenly fixes everything. But real life rarely works that way. In most families, meaningful change begins with something much smaller, a habit. After that difficult evening in our home, when stress finally surfaced between my wife and me, we both realized something simple but important. Life had become too fast. Not because anything terrible had happened. But because small routines had slowly disappeared. Conversations were shorter. Evenings were rushed. And the calm rhythm that once made our family feel connected had quietly faded. Living in our small town in Georgia, we had seen how many families protect their relationships through simple daily rituals. Morning coffee together. Walking around the neighborhood after dinner. Talking on the porch while children play in the yard. Those habits may seem ordinary, but psychologists say they are extremely powerful. According to research from the University of Virginia's Family Studies Department, couples who maintain regular small routines together experience stronger emotional connection and lower stress levels. Routines create stability. Stability creates emotional safety. And emotional safety allows relationships to grow. So after that tense evening, my wife and I made a very small agreement. Every evening, after the children finished their homework and went to bed, we would spend 20 quiet minutes talking. No phones. No television. Just conversation. At first, the idea sounded almost too simple. But simplicity can be powerful. The next evening, after the house became quiet, we sat together at the kitchen table again. The same table where many ordinary family moments had happened before. The room felt calm. Outside, the Georgia night air carried the distant sound of crickets. For the first few minutes, we talked about simple things. How the children were doing in school. Plans for the weekend. Groceries we needed to buy. Normal conversations. But gradually something interesting happened. Without distractions, our conversations became deeper. We talked about how our week had really felt. About things that had made us tired. About moments that made us laugh. This is something relationship researchers call emotional check-ins. When couples regularly talk about their internal experiences, they prevent stress from building silently. Instead of problems growing in the dark, they are addressed early and calmly. Within a few days, I noticed something surprising. Those 20 minutes became the most peaceful part of the day. Work stress faded. Household chaos settled down. The house felt calmer. But the real change happened inside our thinking. The brain responds strongly to positive routines. When people experience consistent supportive conversations, the brain begins associating the relationship with safety and comfort instead of stress. Hope grows naturally in that environment. One evening during our new routine, my wife asked a question. "Do you remember what you said about hope last week?" I smiled. "Yes." I asked if hope can rebuild a life. She nodded. "And what do you think now?" I thought about it for a moment. The answer felt clearer than it had a week earlier. I think hope grows from habits. She smiled. That sounds about right. And suddenly the idea made perfect sense. Hope is not something dramatic. It is something people practice. Through conversations. Through patience. Through small repeated actions that strengthen relationships. Even the atmosphere inside our home began changing. The children seemed calmer. Family dinners felt more relaxed. There was more laughter again. None of this happened instantly. It grew slowly over several days. Psychologists often refer to this process as behavioral momentum. When people begin repeating positive habits, those habits create emotional momentum that spreads into other parts of life. In simple words, one good habit often leads to other improvements. One evening, while we were sitting outside on the porch after dinner, I noticed something interesting. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had weeks earlier. The same quiet street. The same trees moving in the evening breeze. The same neighbors walking their dogs. But my experience of that place felt different. Before, the quiet town had felt almost lonely. Now it felt peaceful. Nothing around me had changed. Only my perspective had. That realization is something psychologists talk about frequently. Human happiness is influenced less by external circumstances and more by the way the brain interprets those circumstances. Hope changes interpretation. It helps the brain focus on possibility instead of pressure. Sitting there on the porch, I remembered the question that had started everything. Can hope rebuild a life? Now the answer felt clearer. Yes. But not through dramatic transformations. Hope rebuilds life slowly. Through conversations that reconnect people. Through habits that strengthen relationships. Through moments when families choose patience instead of frustration. That evening, one of our children came outside and sat beside us. They looked up at the night sky. "Why are the stars brighter here?" they asked. I laughed softly. "They're not brighter," I said. "We just notice them more." That sentence surprised me even as I said it. Because it also described what had happened inside my own thinking. The good parts of life had always been there. family, connection, quiet evenings, simple kindness. Hope did not create those things. Hope helped me see them again. But the most powerful lesson about hope was still waiting. Because the perspective that would change everything would come from the youngest members of our family. Children. And the way they see the future. What our children taught me about hope. Children see the world differently from adults. Adults look at life and see responsibilities. Children look at life and see possibilities. This difference may sound simple, but it changes everything. After my wife and I began our small evening habit of talking together, those quiet 20 minutes after the children went to bed, something interesting started happening inside our home. The atmosphere slowly changed. Nothing dramatic. The same house. The same routines. The same busy family life. But the energy felt lighter. You could hear it in small ways. More laughter at the dinner table. Less tension in ordinary conversations. Even the children seemed to notice the difference. And sometimes, children reveal truths adults have forgotten. One Saturday morning, the Georgia sun was already warm outside. In many parts of the southern United States, weekends start slowly. People drink coffee on their porches, mow their lawns, or take their children to nearby parks. Our family decided to spend the morning at a small community park not far from our house. It was one of those simple neighborhood parks. A playground. A few benches under tall trees. A walking path around a small grassy field. Nothing special. But places like that are very common in small American towns. They give families space to breathe, talk, and spend time together away from screens and busy schedules. The children ran ahead toward the playground almost immediately. My wife and I followed slowly behind them. Watching children play is an interesting experience for adults. They climb. They run. They fall down. Then they stand up and try again. There is no hesitation. No long analysis. Just action. Psychologists often explain that children naturally have what is called a growth mindset. They believe effort leads to improvement, so failure feels temporary instead of permanent. Adults, however, often lose that mindset over time. We become cautious. We overthink. We worry about making mistakes. Standing near the playground, I watched one of my children trying to climb a tall rope ladder. The first attempt didn't work. They slipped down halfway. But instead of feeling discouraged, they laughed and tried again. Second attempt. Still difficult. Third attempt. A little higher this time. Finally, after several tries, they reached the top and raised both arms in the air like a champion. I couldn't help smiling. My wife looked at me and said something quietly. Children are very good at hope. She was right. Children do not usually think about hope as an idea. They simply practice it. Every time they try again. Every time they fall and stand back up. Every time they believe the next attempt might work. Researchers in developmental psychology say that young children naturally believe effort leads to progress. It is only later, through repeated disappointment or pressure, that people begin doubting their ability to improve situations. In other words, adults slowly learn to fear failure. Children haven't learned that fear yet. Watching my child celebrate reaching the top of that rope ladder, I realized something important. The same principle applies to life. Marriage. family relationships, personal growth. Hope grows when people try again. Not perfectly. Just repeatedly. Later that morning, we sat together on a wooden bench while the children continued playing. The park was full of small sounds. Kids laughing. Birds moving through the trees. Parents talking quietly nearby. One of my children came running over with excitement. "Did you see that?" they asked. "Yes," I said. "That was amazing." They smiled proudly. "I almost gave up," they said. Then they added something that stayed in my mind. "But I wanted to see if I could do it." That sentence sounded so simple. But inside it was the entire secret of hope. Hope is curiosity about what might happen if you try again. Many adults lose that curiosity. Responsibilities, stress, and past disappointments slowly convince people that effort may not be worth it. But children remind us of something powerful. Trying again is not foolish. It is how progress happens. That afternoon, as we walked home from the park, the Georgia sky stretched wide and blue above us. The streets were quiet again. A neighbor waved from across the road. And suddenly I realized how much my perspective had changed in just a short period of time. A few weeks earlier, I had been sitting on the porch late at night wondering if hope could truly rebuild a life. Now the answer seemed almost obvious. Hope does not arrive like a miracle. It grows like a habit. Through conversations. Through patience. Through families choosing to support each other. Through children reminding adults that trying again is always possible. Back at home, the children rushed inside to get snacks. My wife and I stayed on the porch for a moment. She looked at me with a thoughtful smile. "You look different these days," she said. "How so?" "You seem lighter." I laughed quietly. "Maybe I am." Because slowly, piece by piece, the question that started this journey was beginning to find its answer. But one final realization was still waiting. A realization about this small Georgia town, about life, about family, and about the quiet power of hope that many people overlook every day. And that final truth would bring this entire story together. Hope in a small Georgia town. Some answers in life arrive slowly. Not in one moment. Not in one conversation. But through many small experiences that quietly reshape the way we see the world. Weeks after that first quiet night on my porch, the night when I asked myself whether hope could rebuild a life, I found myself sitting in the same place again. The same wooden porch. The same quiet street in our small Georgia town. The same warm evening air moving slowly through the trees. Across the road, the familiar street lamp lit the pavement in a soft yellow circle. At first glance, nothing had changed. The houses were the same. The neighbors were the same. The rhythm of the town was exactly as it had always been. But inside my mind, everything felt different. Sometimes life changes not because the world changes, but because our understanding changes. I sat there with a cup of coffee again, watching the calm street. A car passed slowly. A neighbor walked a dog down the sidewalk. Somewhere far away, a train horn sounded faintly in the distance. Simple sounds. Simple life. And suddenly I realized something important. Hope had been quietly rebuilding my life the entire time. Not in dramatic ways, but in the smallest possible moments. In a short conversation with Mr. Daniel at the coffee shop. In the kindness of a barista greeting customers with a smile. In a quiet discussion with my wife at the kitchen table. In the laughter of our children playing in the park. In 20 minutes of honest conversation each night. Each moment was small. But together they created something powerful. Psychologists often describe hope as a process of reconstruction. When people begin seeing possibilities again, their brains slowly rebuild motivation, emotional stability, and confidence. Hope does not erase problems. But it changes how people face them. Before this journey, I had been focusing mostly on pressure, responsibilities, schedules, expectations. But now something else had become visible. The good parts of life that had always been there. Family dinners, neighborhood conversations, evening walks, children learning and growing. These things had not appeared suddenly. They had simply been hidden behind stress. And hope had slowly uncovered them again. The porch door opened behind me. My wife stepped outside and sat beside me. The light from the living room spilled gently across the wooden floor. Thinking again, she asked. I smiled. A little. She looked down the quiet street. This town is peaceful at night. It really is, I said. And suddenly I understood something about small towns in America. People sometimes think quiet places are boring. Too slow. Too ordinary. But those quiet places often protect something valuable. Space. Space for conversation. Space for families to reconnect. Space for people to notice the small details of life again. In bigger, faster cities, life can move so quickly that people forget to look around. Here, the slower rhythm creates room for reflection. Room for hope to grow. After a few minutes, my wife asked a question. So, what do you think now? I knew what she meant. The question that had started everything. Can hope rebuild a life? I thought about the past few weeks. About the difficult moments. The conversations. The small habits we had begun. The laughter that had slowly returned to our home. And the answer felt simple. Yes, I said quietly. But not the way people expect. She looked at me with curiosity. What do you mean? I leaned back in my chair and looked up at the dark Georgia sky. Hope does not arrive like a miracle. It does not appear overnight and suddenly solve every problem. Instead, hope works like construction. Slow. Patient. Brick by brick. A conversation today. A better habit tomorrow. A moment of patience when frustration appears. A decision not to give up on the people who matter most. Piece by piece, those small actions rebuild something stronger. Trust. Connection. Family. Life. The porch light flickered softly above us. Inside the house, one of the children laughed at something on television. Another quiet, ordinary moment. And suddenly I understood the most important truth of this entire story. Hope had never been far away. It had always been present. In small conversations. In family routines. In everyday kindness. It simply required attention. And maybe that is the real message of this story. If life feels heavy sometimes. If responsibilities feel overwhelming. If you ever sit quietly and wonder whether things can truly improve. Remember. This, hope rarely arrives as a dramatic event. It begins in small places. A conversation. A new habit. A moment of patience. A decision to try again tomorrow. And sometimes, all it takes is a quiet evening in a small Georgia town to realize that your life is not as broken as it once seemed. It may simply be waiting for you to start rebuilding it, one small hopeful step at a time. Hope rarely knocks on your door in a dramatic way. Most of the time, it grows quietly, inside small conversations, simple family moments, and the decision to try again tomorrow. If this real English story about life, love, and hope in a small Georgia town spoke to you today, imagine what the next story might reveal about your own life. So before you leave, take one small step with me, subscribe to this channel, turn on the notification bell, and join thousands of viewers practicing slow, real-life English listening through emotional storytelling. Because sometimes the next story you hear might be the one that changes the way you see your own life.